for people.
Hi everybody, hello. Good evening. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Alvin Sahor Marty Wood, and I'm an assistant professor in the English department here at Rice University, where I'm also a faculty affiliate with the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, as well as the Chow Center for Asian Studies. It is on behalf of Rice University's Chow Center for Asian Studies that I'd like to welcome you all to the first lecture of the 2024 Transnational Asia Speaker Series, which is made possible through the generosity of the Ting Sung and Wei Fong Chow Foundation. Today's event would not have come to fruition without the enthusiastic support of the Chow Center's Executive Committee, including the Center Director, Lisa Balabanlalar, and the tireless work and dedication of Hehun Matos and Amber Simzik. For those of you joining us via the Zoom webinar, we're broadcasting from Kraft Hall in Houston, Texas, on the traditional lands of the Atacapa Ishak people. And we acknowledge this indigenous history of the location, which many of us here now call home, and we wish to uplift the contemporary voices of the 6 bands of the Atacapa Ishak Nation, currently residing in southeastern Texas and Louisiana. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Vernadette Gonzalez, who is a professor of ethnic studies and Asian American and Asian diaspora studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Gonzalez's interdisciplinary humanities-based research broadly examines cultures of imperialism with a focus on the United States and its colonial territories and interventions in Asia and the Pacific. A central thematic of her work is how race, indigeneity, gender, and sexuality intersect and operate, sometimes together and sometimes in opposition, in the cultural terrains of empire. Her groundbreaking first book, Securing Paradise, Tourism and Militarism in Hawaii and the Philippines, which was published by Duke University Press in 2013, explores the mutually constitutive relationship between tourism and militarism in Hawaii and the Philippines, 2 sites entangled within the longue durée history of US empire in the Pacific. Interrogating the persistence of the military tourism or militourism nexus across the Asia-Pacific region, Securing Paradise persuasively demonstrates how disparate notions of security and paradise are operationalized and authorized by a profoundly global understanding of US militarism's historical, economic, and ideological imperatives. Through her brilliant readings of histories, cultural objects, place-based sites, and relational practices as diverse as novels, Marcosian highway infrastructure, memorialization at Pearl Harbor, American television series, the practices of helicopter excursions on Kauai, and the palimpsestic imperial layers at play within jungle tours at the Subic Bay Freeport Zone, Professor Gonzalez's fearless cultural studies methodology resulted in an exemplary text revealing the sheer breadth, once material and ideological, of American militarism. Securing Paradise, I should also mention, was named the best book in cultural studies by the Association for Asian American Studies in 2015. In 2019, Professor Gonzalez co-edited with Hokulani K. Akau, Detours, a decolonial guide to Hawaii, also published by Duke, which curates alternative place-based narratives, art, and itineraries that present a decolonial archive and vision for life in Hawaii. Detours now anchors a groundbreaking book series with Duke University Press, with volumes on Palestine, Guam, Okinawa, Singapore, Korea, the San Francisco Bay Area, Puerto Rico, and other sites in development. Professor Gonzalez's most recent monograph, Empire's Mistress, starring Isabel Rosario Cooper, which was published by Duke University Press in 2021, is an exploration of the intimacies of imperial geopolitics through the life story of mixed-race vaudeville and film actress, and sometimes mistress, of generous Douglas MacArthur. Following Cooper from the Philippines to Washington, D.C. to Hollywood, where she died penniless, Gonzalez frames her not as tragic heroine, but as someone caught within the violent histories of US imperialism. In this way, Gonzalez uses Cooper's life as a means to explore the contours of empire as experienced on the scale of personal relationships. Along the way, Gonzalez fills in the archival gaps of Cooper's life with speculative fictional interludes that both unsettle the authority of official archives and dislodge the established one-dimensional characterizations of her. By presenting Cooper as a complex historical subject who lived at the crossroads of American colonialism in the Philippines, Gonzalez demonstrates how intimacy and love are woven into the infrastructure of empire. And yet, As Professor Gonzalez forcefully reminds us in this most recent book, quote, "This is not a love story. War, imperialism, and occupation are its defining conditions, the violent historical forces that move the action along. Going beyond the salacious details of a scandalous affair, this account illuminates the shifting intimate relations that underpinned the project of American empire in the Philippines just before and well after the brutal sweep of the Philippine-American War. It is as much about the personal registers of American empire, the ways in which empire's effects play out on the bodies, relationships, and lives of colonized people, as it is about Isabel Cooper. While she takes center stage in this version of the story, her choices embody how the dimensions of the geopolitical are carried out through the close encounters between colonizer and colonized. Isabel Cooper's life is intimately stitched into the larger canvas of American empire in the Philippines. Likewise, the threads of American empire are woven into her story. Indeed, that was a long quote, sorry, that was from Vernadette, I didn't write that. Indeed, Professor Gonzalez's work more broadly has always asked us to attend to these personal registers of empire. Since the continued entanglements with US imperialism are simultaneously world-binding and intimately lived. And any understanding that includes empire's more intimate registers fails to grasp it, even in its partial totality. Continuing this pronounced research through line into her most recent in-progress work, Professor Gonzalez is now at work on a book on hospitality, interracial militarized sex work, tourism, entertainment, and other embodiments of invitation and encounter. A forthcoming essay on the gendered Asian laboring body in circuits of entertainment will mark the first publication from this most recent line of inquiry and will be published in August of this year in Bangtang Remixed, an interdisciplinary critical reader about the K-pop group BTS, which Professor Gonzalez is also co-editing. Today's lecture, Hospitality's Anatomies, is from this most recent research project, as Professor Gonzalez continues to ask how attention to the intimate and affective labors that sustain capitalism, militarism, and imperialism help us understand hospitality's material force. And now, if you'll let me, a brief biographical note of things. I first encountered the intellectually brilliant and praxis-oriented scholarship of Professor Gonzalez actually too many years ago, in a graduate seminar with a dear mentor of mine, Professor Dorothy Fujita Roney. I distinctly remember Dorothy telling all of us, in her usual impassioned way, about this remarkable book, Securing Paradise, that promised to change both the scope and methodologies of the burgeoning field of Trans-Pacific studies. We read the book in its entirety, and it set all of us ablaze with both its fearlessness in the construction of its manifold archive, its diverse methodologies, and its clear articulation of its own political stakes. I was then fortunate enough to finally meet Vernadette at a 2019 conference hosted by the Center for Philippine Studies at the University of Hawai'i, Manoa, the institution Vernadette taught at for many years in the American Studies department. Vernadette the person turned out to be just as generous as her scholarship. In the intervening years, I've experienced firsthand just how seriously Vernadette takes mentoring junior faculty and graduate students in our shared fields, and it speaks volumes about how she imagines the role of research and pedagogy in the more expansive present political moment we all find ourselves inhabiting together. Professor Gonzalez, as a researcher, activist, and mentor, has inspired an entire generation of scholars working in transnational Asian studies, critical ethnic studies, the histories of imperialism, Philippine and Filipinx American studies, decolonial thought, and of course, cultural studies. It has been a pleasure thinking through and alongside Vernadette's work for years now, and I'm so thrilled to welcome her to Rice as a distinguished lecturer in our Transnational Asia Speaker Series. And please join me in extending a warm Rice welcome to Professor Vernadette Vicuña Gonzalez.
I'm like all verklempt now. That was such a generous introduction. Hi, everybody. Happy Friday. Thank you for spending Friday afternoon with me. I'm really grateful to have you all here to listen to what I'm calling my working mess. This is a very preliminary, pre-preliminary stage of the project. But before I get started, I wanted to first thank the Chow Center for Asian Studies for sponsoring this opportunity to share work in progress, and in particular, Alden for the invitation. Thank you so much. Alyssa, Heihan, Amber for handling the logistics so smoothly. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share this work in particular, in which I'm using as an opportunity to revisit some earlier earlier things, but anyway, that I won't necessarily get to in this particular version of the talk, on material cultures and practices of hospitality. And I'm especially excited to share this in the context of a community structured by the study of Asia in a transnational lens. So I've shaped this talk around a roundabout journey with a specific departure point and set of conditions, that of the COVID-19 pandemic, that helped illuminate for me some connections around hospitality as a framework and method. So I'll also, as Alden already mentioned, be pulling in some unexpected guides whose labor and itineraries are both exemplars and exceptions to the anatomies of hospitality that I'm attempting to sketch out. So I ask for your indulgence as we take a detour with BTS, that BTS, yes. So for somebody who looks at tourism and militarism as modes and apparatuses of US imperialism in Asia and the Pacific, the pandemic foregrounded struggles around mobility, access, availability, and intensified questions around hospitality and welcome, and particularly the gendered, racialized dimensions of both. So in other words, the pandemic laid bare the nature and terms of the encounter and its stark calculus of life and death, and how these things shape the kinds of futures we can imagine and strive for. At the time of the pandemic, I was living and working in Hawaii, where the tourism stoppage and folks there say respite illuminated its volatility and the painful price of a small place's economic reliance on tourism's exoticized extractions. It also created space for possible alternative imaginings to tourism's overdetermined narrative. Ironically, it's not switching slides. Am I doing something wrong? Here. There we go. Never mind. So ironically, Detour's A Decolonial Guide to Hawaii had just been published months prior to the shutdown. So we had hoped that it would kind of engage the tourism economy of Hawaii, and then all of a sudden that economy just disappeared. So Detours was aimed at subverting the authority and authorship of the guidebook and generating and shaping desire for Hawaii. It curated the works of contemporary activists, artists, and scholars undertaking place-based projects grounded in reciprocity, native sovereignty, and collective liberation. The book posed the question of what decolonization, true aloha aina, or love and care for the land, stewardship of the land, what it looks like in the context of Hawaii. It also gestured to what radical hospitality might look like, especially in the context of Asia and the Pacific, at least for me. So the pandemic, with its wholesale interruption of tourism and demotion of tourist privilege as a key priority in a destination place like Hawaii, intensified the stakes of life shaped by and refracted through hospitality. So how can we think about hospitality as a concept beyond merely tourism, even if it's in its most visible iterations, we were seeing it play out through confrontations over the rights of tourists, or the benefits of, that tourism brings to communities, or its encroachments on those perceived to be the hosts. And we saw this in Hawaii most recently with the Maui fires and the whole discourse around tourism. So the narratives and transactions of hospitality that are placed in relief by the tourist encounter stretch far beyond the parameters of a holiday or its pandemic interruptions. They structure orientations to people and places deemed other, and make up a constellation of stories about race, gender, and difference that have a social force, especially where struggles over land, sovereignty, and occupation are the defining of often less visible conditions of life in these places. So for instance, the concept of hospitality quickly reaches its limits when the entitlements of tourism are applied to other kinds of mobility, such as those of refugees or migrants or those crossing a border. So I propose that hospitality and the kinds of narratives, relationships, and objects that lend it cohesion and coherence might help us toward a theory of racial encounter and obligation that is built on liberation and mutuality. So drawing from an oceanic genealogy of hospitality, Paul Lyons, a scholar of American pacifism, extends Derrida's theorizations on hospitality in its negation of sovereignty. Lyons notes that under conditions of colonialism, which have already violated the invitation, it is the host who is under siege, so much so that, quote, the foundation upon which a hospitable relationship might be built and sustained is instead in concrete ways poured over the backs of the host and hardens over time, unquote. So colonialism, in other words, perverts hospitality, keeping intact fantasies of the welcoming native in order to entrench itself into the host society. So these currents of oceanic critique gesture to how hospitality, routed through and reliant on the feminine host, indigenous, Asian, Latin, Black, and the permission, welcome, and consent they are imagined to extend, even as that same invitation of hospitality is not necessarily extended to them. So hospitality's anatomies, so this working title of my working mess, takes up questions about the constituent parts and interrelated workings of hospitality that currently animate tourism, militarism, and occupation, particularly in Asia and the Pacific. It turns us to the foundational logics that generate the invitation and shape the terms of the encounter of this thing we have come to call hospitality. And at this very early stage in the project, I'm interested in how a focus on hospitality illuminates in particular the racial gendered labor, particularly the labor of intimacy and invitation that hospitality turns on and upon which it relies. So in this sense, I am also building on the archive and method of my second monograph, Empire's Mistress, which Alden mentioned, which was also published in the midst of the pandemic. As he mentioned, it was structured by the episodic life, analysis of the life of Isabel Rosario Cooper, a mixed-race vaudeville and film actor who was also Douglas MacArthur's one-time mistress. And the book examines how alibis for imperial consent are made manifest through the register of the intimate. So I think of somebody like Isabel Cooper, who's here in, this is one of the headshots from her time in Hollywood, when she was trying to get roles best suited for brown women, right around World War II. So I think of this person, Isabel Cooper, as someone who navigated the intimate and public entertainment stages of US imperialism, from Manila to Washington, DC, and Hollywood. I think of her as a kind of archetype of care worker, whose labor underpins narratives of colonial racial love in Vince Raphael's formulation of love, which we can think of as in a sense, a perverse translation of hospitality. I also think of her story as a necessary supplement to studies of labor in Asian American studies in particular, that of migrant manual labor, primarily masculine, that understand this labor as essential both to the consolidation and unsettlement of the white supremacist nation state. So hospitality's emphasis on the register of the intimate expands and connects research on care work, previously explored through the categories of medical, child, and geriatric care, or through mediated carried out through the proximity and distance of technology as theorized by Alden and John Patios, among others, as well as militarized sex work. So this project, Hospitality's Anatomies, is my current attempt to disentangle and weave together these genealogies of hospitality in Asia and the Pacific. So for this particular presentation, and I will say that it is really, it's so in its infancy that I haven't even decided on the objects. I'm just kind of taking you on a trip, like a brain trip with me as I try to figure out how I'm approaching this project. So it's my current attempt to disentangle and weave together these genealogies, like I mentioned, of hospitality in Asia and the Pacific. And I'm pivoting to the crucial labor that Asian and Pacific women and feminized subjects undertake to generate and sustain hospitality in the region. So I'm going to take you on a trip with me across a very rough itinerary of US imperialism circuits in the region. I ask how hospitality and its constituent parts are generated, sustained, repurposed, instrumentalized under extractionist regimes, following circulations of hospitality's anatomies across several trans-Pacific sites that are deeply interconnected through US empire and inter-Asian state collaborations. So we'll go to Hawaii, we'll go to Atlanta, we'll go to Seoul, we'll go to Olongapo, back to Hawaii. So apart from tourism's interruptions, this is my confession, that highlighted the centrality of hospitality in our modern mobilities and subjectivities, the pandemic also foregrounded our deep reliance on the labor of care. The vulnerability also and the precarity of these racialized and gendered workers as they traverse the circuits of care work. This was most obvious with so-called essential medical frontliners, right? And I say essential because that term gets used in very politicized ways, such as nurses, but also with more ambiguously listed categories of care work, such as entertainers, who perform their labor for audiences from 1 to tens of thousands, and who were called on to ease the sense of isolation and despair wrought by the pandemic. So this work, particularly as taken on by Asian and Pacific entertainers, is part of the fabric of hospitality that not only props up tourism, but interstate relations in the region. So I'll begin with a moment that's both unexpected yet emblematic of how hospitality was refracted through the pandemic's lens. I'm about to get into my BTS thing, okay? So this is my BTS's method, my initial BTS's method as a way to try out some of these ideas. It's not that I actually envisioned the end work focusing on K-pop. Maybe I will, maybe I won't, I'm not sure yet. Just that in this particular moment, it was an entry point for me to think through some of these circuits. And it's also, I think, just thinking about the teachability and how to teach this work. It's one of the, K-pop is one of those global texts that has a notable reach and a translation to it. So it makes for a useful kind of common medium for all of us. So the fandom of BTS, arguably already the world's most popular K-pop group at the time of the pandemic, grew exponentially during the pandemic. Many old and new fans turned to BTS for assurance that life goes on. The group and their pandemic album in particular, as well as Hallyu more broadly, became sources of emotional care that many of their fans turned to in the face of systemic governmental neglect and incompetence, which exacerbated the trauma, precarity, and isolation of life under capitalism. So BTS's body of work during the pandemic presents another kind of gendered Asian care work that sustains people even as it remains entangled in imperial relations and capitalist extraction. So when their global stadium tour was canceled, their entertainment company was savvy in launching massive concert streaming events that beamed their performances as well as their own anguish and sadness at being separated from fans into the intimate spaces of homes around the world. Apart from their album, BTS extended scenes of normalcy and home through their pandemic version of a travel series, In the Soup, which I watched religiously, which showcased them in their everyday domestic scenes, eating, cooking, cleaning up, playing games in the bucolic South Korean countryside. And it offered an invitation into intimate and shared spaces that lifted the spirits of old and new fans alike. So I was one of those fans. As I jokingly related to other colleagues who shared the same appreciation for BTS. Turning to BTS as an escape was a kind of therapeutic moment, or a kind of therapeutic escape from the fear and uncertainty that the pandemic brought. So it was during this deeply personal and academic conversation that I turned to the large body of content. I became curious about their past work that they had already been producing since their debut in 2013, which tapped, like they were particularly genius really at tapping into and cultivating deeply parasocial relationships with their public. So as a scholar of tourism, I was drawn in particular to a reality travel series that they produced from 2016 to 2019 called Bon Voyage, which follows the 7 members as they vacation in various sites around the world. So the middle image from the flyer for this talk is a screen grab from a moment in season 2, which took place in Hawai'i. So for those reasons were especially interesting to me. The episode was titled Enjoy a Hula Dance, and it features the members attending dinner and a stage show at the Polynesian Cultural Center, a 42-acre cultural theme park on Oahu that houses 7 Pacific Island cultures. So after a day packed with tourist activities like visiting a beach and touring Ku'uloa Ranch, which is a site of many Hollywood films, the BTS members, dressed in bright aloha shirts, sit down for a luau, followed by a stage performance of song and dance from Oceania. So what follows is a staged fantasy of Polynesia. We see rapid fire, sensual Tahitian dance with a sort of staccato hip movements accentuated by low-slung decorative belts and the feathered headdresses. We see a hula kahiko, a traditional hula performed by male dancers to a very percussive kind of chant, lots of chest slapping, rhythmic stomps, sharp gestures emphasized with like oiled musculature. The BTS members are very impressed as part of the audience, and they comment on the performance using touch points familiar to K-pop idols, the fitness of the dancers' bodies, the synchronization of their steps, the charisma of the dancer who is the center. And then with particular fanfare from one of the BTS members, a line of women glide on stage to a wistful song, accompanied by an ukulele. The dancers are dressed in purple bandeaus and floor-length skirts, and their hair, accessorized with white orchids, is pulled back tightly from their faces. The BTS members immediately imitate the characteristic undulating arms and hula hands of the dancers. As typical of the Awana style, a modern version that gained traction in the 20th century with the expansion of tourism in the islands, the dancers' movements are sinuous, evoking romance and femininity. This particular dancer was particularly captivating to the BTS members. Her smile is direct, her welcoming gaze complements the mood. Bon Voyage editors insert a caption describing her honey-dropping eyes, translating a Korean expression for eyes that are full of love and affection. The members exclaim in admiration, with one of them adding, "She should have debuted as an idol group member." At the end of the day, the members reflect on the performances again, commenting on the female hula dancers' skill and charisma, and conclude that they had witnessed idol members in Hawaii. So I linger on this moment because it captures the strange yet unsurprising juxtapositions that are animated in circuits of entertainment and hospitality in Asia and Pacific. The scene with BTS's anticipation and appreciation of hula shows how effectively hula has been translated into a register of tourism, transcending language and culture, and how central its eroticized invitation is to the fantasy that Hawaii tourism sells. The juxtaposition of BTS as Korean entertainers with the dancing bodies of Hawaiian women illuminates the indispensability of gendered care work in smoothing out post-Cold War interstate relations and narratives of partnership and peace between the United States and its allies in Asia and the Pacific, obscuring the deep social inequalities, environmental devastation, military occupations that shape life in the islands. So the provision of hospitality, pleasure, diversion, and healing through care work was a crucial part of the machinery of imperial occupation of the region. Many scholars have already argued this. So it continues to the present and was undertaken mostly by Indigenous and Asian women, as observed by folks like Adrienne Amada with regard to hula in Hawaii. So relatedly, Isabel Cooper, the subject of my last monograph, was an entertainer of the US military on stage and of its highest ranked soldier off stage. She also made a living during her time in Hollywood in the 40s and 50s, being a brown woman who could sort of substitute right into a hula choreography, both on film and in nightclubs. So it's no surprise that such spaces for performances of the hospitable exotic proliferated during the Cold War. So just as the question of Hawaii's statehood was on the horizon, and its ramping up of tourism as an economic pillar was also happening, hula was a form of multiculturalism that was easy to consume, which perpetuated desirable fantasies about welcome and consent. So I see BTS's work as entertainers as inextricable from this history, and I was struck by their presence as tourists in a place profoundly defined by touristic desire, while also simultaneously working and creating content as K-pop idols, and thus lending comfort and enjoyment to me in the midst of the pandemic. Tourism's reinterpretation of aloha, the greeting, the sentiment of love, or the honey dropping eyes, as gendered sexualized consent is instrumental to the erasure of historical and ongoing dispossession of Native Hawaiians. So while problematic in its designation and denigration of sex work as prostitution, Haunani K-Trask's critique of Hawaii's dependence on tourism as prostitution provides a starting point for thinking about the centrality of, quote, lovely hula hands, and those are her words, in generating a narrative of invitation, welcome, and consent so essential to tourism, but also other dispossessions. Today, for instance, Hawaii's economy is deeply dependent on tourism, despite the fact that its profits flow to non-local corporations, while squeezing the value out of Indigenous and Asian settler labor and cultures. On Oahu, for instance, nearly 1/4 of the island's landmass is under US military occupation. But you never see that, right? So the myth of the dream place, and this is a phrase that the BTS members repeat again and again over the episodes in Hawaii, allied how the islands serve as headquarters for the US Indo-Pacific Command, which oversees over half of the world's surface and population in the geostrategic Asia-Pacific region. And as host, also Hawaii hosts biannual military exercises among the US's hemispheric allies. So the interlinked geographies of South Korea, Atlanta, and the Philippines, which in this presentation highlights in particular, are similarly shaped by US militarisms, and I argue sustained by hospitality's anatomies. So in these performances of Polynesian culture, translated and refracted through BTS's own content as entertainers, we're able to see how Asian Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian women, interchangeable in an economy that traffics in multiculturalism to erase Indigenous dispossession, are especially positioned as natural hosts. The hula dancers' equation with hospitality resonates with BTS and other tourists because it underscores commonly understood and held beliefs about who does this kind of work and why certain women are best suited for it. Yet this kind of labor is something BTS members are also intimately familiar with themselves, right? So BTS's exploits in Bon Voyage and in their pandemic domestic series further endeared the band to their, like me, to their growing international fandom and augmented their official role as Seoul tourism ambassadors, a role which overlapped with the show's airtime. Today, one might argue that as avatars of Korean allure, BTS has come to play a similar role to Hawaii's iconic hula girl for South Korea's growing international tourism market. The Korean state recruits the world's most recognizable K-pop idols into the work of welcome and hospitality that helps stabilize the region's interstate relations, as well as their cultural reputation and economy, while concealing the realities of a militarized Korean peninsula, although BTS are now having to serve mandatory military service in very visible ways. So in the hula episode, BTS's recognition of their fellow entertainers and their brief appearance on the hula stage point to their common roots and overlapping routes in the post-Cold War landscape of Asia and the Pacific. Tracking BTS during the pandemic also illuminated how circuits of care work converged through violence. BTS emerged as spokespeople against anti-Asian violence within a mostly American context, which was kind of interesting. They were also one of the first K-pop groups to ally themselves with the Black Lives Matter movement. But the image on the left side, the leftmost side of the flyer for this talk, which is also on the left here, is from press coverage of the 2021 Atlanta killings as the pandemic began to kind of wane, but racialized and xenophobic violence against Asians in the United States spiked. In the most shared tweet of 2021, BTS released a statement following the fatal March shootings of 8 people in Atlanta massage parlors, 6 of whom were Asian women and 4 of whom were of Korean descent. The group denounced the hatred and violence stoked by pandemic race-mongering and shared their own pain of being targeted by anti-Asian discrimination during their travels. So coming from young, cosmopolitan, highly successful professionals, the statement was a sobering reminder of the persistence and reach of anti-Asian racism, much as it was a gesture of solidarity. Quote, "What is happening right now cannot be dissociated from our identity as Asians." So I found myself asking why BTS didn't call attention particularly to Koreanness in this moment, even as identification with the nationality of those killed was a likely impetus for their statement. So while they called also attention to Asianness as the explanation for the tragedy in Atlanta, the rise of anti-Asian violence manifested in distinctly gendered ways. Asian women were and are by far the primary targets of this violence. So the sexualized occupation, in addition of those who were killed in Atlanta, is just as instrumental also, right? Because we're thinking about gender, as Asianists and understanding the workings of this violence. All 6 women worked at 2 massage parlors targeted by the shooter, yet BTS's statement makes no mention of this. This kind of intimate care work is perhaps too shamefully yoked with sex work, that perversion of hospitality that is the constant and regulated companion to U.S. militarization in Asia and the Pacific, including U.S. bases in South Korea. And while BTS has not shied away from previously taboo topics such as mental health or even U.S. anti-Black racism, a critique of U.S. militarism's and Korean militarism's intimate reach into the lives of Korean women, especially with their own military service looming, was perhaps too much. This may be because their own labor in the world as entertainers and their feminization due to this labor, this may be a stretch, their own feminization due to this labor and their Asianness share U.S.-Korea post-Cold War genealogies and circuits of labor mobility with those of the massage workers. So I'm kind of thinking of them in those same circuits. So linking the Atlanta massage workers to the hula dancers of Bon Voyage and BTS as entertainers makes visible the complicated relations that the gamut of hospitality as care work sustains in this region. The Atlanta killers' perceptions, for instance, of Asian women as objects of sexual temptation has roots in U.S. Asian exclusion laws from the late 1800s, which framed Chinese women as prostitutes to prevent them from immigrating for immoral purposes, logics akin to Calvinist missionaries' views of Hawaiian women dancing the hula. So these ideas were recycled during 20th century U.S. wars in Asia, which translated racialized fantasies into service, entertainment, and care work occupations for women in Asia and the Pacific, as well as Asian migrants to the United States. The presence of Korean women in massage parlors in Atlanta is a direct outcome of these histories. So the relocation of the Korean military camptown sex industry within U.S. borders was actually precipitated by trans-Pacific movements of labor and racialized sexualized fantasies that traveled with them. Yuri Dolan notes the surprising and little-known fact that 90% of, quote, massage parlors, saunas, and health spas operating as fronts for the illegal sex trade that are adjacent to U.S. military bases in the U.S. South were staffed by a Korean workforce that was made up of GI brides or former GI brides. I did not know this prior to this research. So when this moment happened, and there was sort of like a silence around this from ETS, that was like a way to kind of access that information. Since the end of World War II, for instance, but especially in the 1970s and 1980s, the immigration of GI brides reproduced the camptown economy on US soil. Korean club owners seeking to move their businesses stateside with the waning US military presence in South Korea brokered marriages between South Korean women and American soldiers. They brought over women who were forced by poverty and exploitative conditions in South Korean camptowns to seek a better life elsewhere, only to fall into further dead bondage in the United States. So massage parlor work, even with and because of its dubious connotations, was the most available opportunity for many of these women to gain a financial foothold. So although women make up a large number of Korean migrant workers to the United States, their labor as entertainers is of a vastly different order than that of BTS and the hula dancers at the Polynesian Cultural Center. The gendered racial love that underpins Cold War military occupations continues to shape the kinds of hospitality Asian women are always expected to extend, no matter where they are, while they themselves are always excluded from its protections. In other words, while BTS might enjoy touring or documenting travel as fandom, travel as work as a large part of how they emotionally connect to their global fandom, other workers in the broad category of entertainment, such as the Korean women in Atlanta and women who continue to work in the camp towns in South Korea, have devastatingly distinct experiences of care work and entertainment mobility. So with the movement of South Korean women entertainers to the US South, the South Korean government created the E6 visa specifically to allow businesses, quote, catering to US troops to import migrant entertainers under the guise of tourism law, shoring up the interstate collaborations that ensure the circulation of different kinds of care work upon which continued militarization of Asia requires and relies. So in South Korea's camp towns, today, Filipino women, Uzbek, Kazakh women have taken the place of South Korean women in nightclubs and massage parlors. I'm kind of just trying to think through the circulations and circuits of entertainment work and hospitality work. So even before this visa category was created, Filipinas especially had long become familiar with these transits and nodes of gendered racialized care work in US military camp towns of their own. They too were familiar with the violence of hospitality's promises, most spectacularly perhaps through the tragic 2014 murder of Jennifer Laude, an alleged sex worker in the Olongapo, Philippines, by an American soldier on leave. So the third image from the flyer, and it's blurred, and I kind of like it blurred, is of the districts that remain in the city in Olongapo, even after the official departure of the US military, because Olongapo remains a site for American men on liberty leave, as well as male tourists seeking sex and companionship from Japan, Australia, and Europe. So Laude, for those of you unfamiliar with the case, was the victim of racist, transphobic, and homophobic violence. But I theorize that her killing has as much to do with how unsettling it was for an American soldier to encounter a script of hospitality that was for him improperly gendered. Asian and Pacific women, after all, are the embodiment of hospitality's anatomies. Their intimate and effective labor is crucial to the invitation that is translated into consent in the region's militaristic spaces. As Ayano Ginoza has argued of Okinawa, the quote, sexual economy of power and desire, end quote, which the US military presence in Olongapo and other militarized camp towns perpetuates, defines the lives of Asian and Pacific women in terms of rapeability and sexual violence. The interstate mechanisms that funnel women from Seoul to Atlanta, from Olongapo to South Korea, gesture to how hospitality's anatomies continue to be that of Asian and Pacific women in transit. So even BTS as Asian entertainers who are men, and we can talk a little bit about how they're sometimes feminized or often feminized, who have the ability to release statements about anti-Asian hate, find themselves framed within and having to navigate these broader Cold War gendered logics of hospitality, albeit in more visible, legitimized fashion. A little over a year after the Atlanta shootings and their original hashtag Stop Asian Hate statement, BTS was invited to the White House to meet with President Biden to help raise awareness about anti-Asian hate as part of the Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So their presence in the White House demonstrates the ways in which a militarized, quote, entertainment diplomatic complex, unquote, has always operated in support of the state, from providing entertainment for troops during wartime to generating goodwill for interstate alliances during times of peace. Lauded by two states and representatives of care work who seemingly exceed or even obscure the category of care work itself, BTS nonetheless are interpolated as embodiments of hospitality. As travel restrictions began to loosen in 2021 and 2022, BTS solidified their image as cultural ambassadors for South Korea, demonstrating the state's recognition of the finger heart, the shorthand for K-pop's cultivation of love and care for its fans, as a diplomatic strategy in support of neoliberal values on the global stage. In late 2022, even as debates continued over the possibility of military exemptions for BTS, the group was deployed as the official public relations ambassadors for the city of Busan's now failed bid to host the 2030 World Expo. So this was in a sense extending their role as Seoul tourism ambassadors. As the band members took the stage in Busan in October 2022, their allure as symbols of care, pleasure, and healing was tightly woven to the city's extension of hospitality to the tens of thousands of fans who flocked to Busan from all over the world and the tens of millions who watched the concert online or followed social media accounts of fellow fans about their experiences. Playing host to the visiting and imagined future national and global community, BTS members helped craft an invitation on a massive scale through their ability to connect, welcome, assure, enthrall, linking their work of entertainment and their brand of care work to the larger state project of the World Exposition. So yet the lead up to the concert and the concert itself belie the limits of a return to tourism's normalcy as a sustaining and sustainable desire. And here's where I want to return to hospitality as manifesting a different kind of relation oriented toward community and liberation. It's not to say that BTS is like the messiah of this at all, by the way. Debates over BTS's impending military service and the fact that Busan would be the last live performance as a group for at least 2 to 3 years tempered the euphoria of the free concert. While of course there were kind of nauseating fandom claims to being a military wife, others wondered about the lingering conditions that necessitated mandatory conscription for South Korean men, and made connections to the legacies of Cold War geopolitics on the peninsula. Others decried how BTS, as the avatars par excellence of K-pop's global success, were being deployed without remuneration to support state interests without its protections. Scholars have already detailed the brutal labor conditions of K-pop as symptomatic of an industrial complex geared toward maximum extraction, of course, of the body's talent and labor, but especially in the wake of the pandemic's ravages and exacerbated by the state's failures in its wake, the gratitude for the ways in which entertainers as providers of care, healing, and release intensified in this concert the already passionate audience response to BTS's performance. So the Busan concert also illuminated the unsettling power of entertainers as providers of joy and community for a mostly female fandom, a demographic that unsurprisingly overlaps with the global care work population. Often discounted as mere entertainment or illicit acts taking place in the shadows of massage parlors or nightclubs, here in its most visible and dynamic form, massive world stage, hosted by the most famous performers in the world, the foundational work and potential reach of the labor of care work writ large is clear. Hospitality writ large is clear. So in other words, even in the limited spaces of a militarized entertainment diplomatic complex, the possibilities for other relationalities of hospitality were sort of in emergence. So I was dancing, I was waving my army light stick at home as one of millions of fans as part of this coeval moment, right? I became aware of how something like BTS operates as a sustaining force for imperial and extractive systems that simultaneously use, denigrate, and abandon the people assigned to this kind of labor, but also in understanding its value, power, and scale. Like, this is a massive kind of concert. There were tens of thousands of tourists who came to this post-pandemic event. We may also find a way to move forward to craft new models of solidarity and labor justice across Asia and the Pacific. And this is very like idealistic language, right? This is part of my working mess. I don't know that's actually going to hold water, that can encompass and cherish our differences. So I want to return to the scene that I began with to think about how these moments might manifest. So again, we find ourselves with BTS at the Polynesian Cultural Center, appreciating the hula, and like BTS, dancing along. Right? So their time at the Polynesian Cultural Center ends with an invitation to learn a hula, decontextualized from hula practice, of course, rooted in years of study and deep cultural knowledge and practice. 3 of the members are called on stage to dance a hula, led by a group of children, while the others look on and tease their bandmates for awkwardly dancing out of sync. And for like folks who dance really well in sync, this was like a really bad hula performance in particular. So it was quite comical. It was a typical tourist scenario, inadvertently revealing how much work goes into the stage work of fantasy. Bon Voyage's main conceit of capturing the spontaneous, unscripted charm of the band works in much the same way, deflecting our gaze from the never-ending labor of BTS crafting their relatable and fun-loving image, while simultaneously boosting Hawaiian tourism. The experience, however, leads to a reflection among BTS members, and thus also extended to their audience, us watching, about the similarities across these entertainment and labor practices. Such fleeting insights illuminate how communities might be brought together through alternative relationalities of hospitality, perhaps bound by reciprocity and obligation that supersede the state or capital, and which might shape an archive and method of decolonial and transnational Asian and Pacific practice. So this moment brought to mind, as I was watching it, other stagings of hula, which are not built on unfettered invitation or access. There is, of course, Haunani-K. Trask's landmark manifesto on tour, the one I had mentioned on tourism industry's prostitution of Native Hawaiian cultures in lovely hula hands, where she infamously and powerfully withdraws her invitation, right, as a Native woman, condemning tourism's erotics of service, availability, and access as legacies that do not fall far from the colonial tree. She says, if you're thinking of visiting my homeland, please do not. We do not want or need any more tourists, and we certainly do not like them, which is like the best thing to hear, right? And there's also Maya Safari's account of unsettling hula's assumed invitation. The invitation's assumed to be built into this particular kind of cultural text, right? So Safari is a hula dancer, and in this shot, this is actually a detours, her account of this. The first time I read her submission, I started just weeping because it was just this incredible account of like how to take back this eroticized practice of hula. So here she is dancing in ceremony to welcome the voyaging canoe Hokulea on Kailua Beach in Honolulu. And there she had to contend, on Oahu, I'm sorry, she had to contend with tourist gazes and insistent framings of her hula dance as something for tourist consumption, right? Like she was in this space and yet people would walk through, would take photos, would just interrupt in really entitled ways, right? As if they had a right to this by way of the transactions defined by hospitality. Safari's story describes how she and her fellow dancers learned how to take back the space of the beach as the landing and ritual space for welcome, rather than a space to which tourists had unconditional access, and to dance hula as a practice for consolidating an indigenous definition of hospitality. As she details in her account, offering mele, which is chanting, and hula in appropriate contexts on the land can not only create safe sovereign spaces that we can return to over and over again, these decolonial acts can also help us envision alternative futures for our communities here. So Trask and Safari's accounts of hula place a cultural practice that has long become tourism's metonym for the racial and gendered aloha, instead within a different register, a register of refusal and native sovereignty. Their insistence on reclaiming a sovereign hospitality through a practice that has in modern Hawaiian history been a primary vehicle for translating Hawaii into a tourism register illuminates the alternative relationalities that undergird radical practice of hospitality. This is hospitality still produced, it's still produced through the labor of intimacy and relationality, but not reducible to an invitation to empire. This is a hospitality not built on the conjoined conditions of indigenous dispossession and death, or gendered racial ideas of mobility and access. In Safari's account, hula consolidates a welcome grounded in reciprocity, one which generates obligations and reinforces relationships that work to counter the inhospitable conditions of empire. So oceanic genealogies of hospitality have not themselves been stories of unconditional giving. They are stories of networks of obligation and trust that draw on the past and oriented toward a more just future. Epeli Ha'ofa names, quote, the ancient practice of reciprocity, unquote, as a core element of hospitality in cultures of Oceania. Relations of, quote, not dependence, but interdependence, unquote, that connect long and vibrant traditions of creativity, refusal, and resistance. Because in oceanic voyaging worlds, practices of hospitality were crucial to survival, right? Like you could not live if you weren't hospitable to each other. And they activated genealogical ties that held hosts and guests accountable for their actions and for each other's well-being. They consolidated community connections across vast oceanic distances, reducing physical separation through the alchemy of care. So there's one last hula example I want to talk about. So this one is of invitation to this constellation in formation. On the big island of Hawaii, in the summer before the pandemic, a makeshift but smoothly running city springs up near the entry road to the Mauna Kea summit. Native Hawaiians and those in solidarity with them are standing up to prevent the building of the 30-meter telescope atop the mountain, citing a call to protect the land in keeping with indigenous principles of aloha aina and stewardship. They block the road to obstruct access to construction vehicles, setting up camp for the long term. Their action draws thousands from all over the islands and around the world to add their voices and even their bodies to the growing movement. The blocked road turns into a space for ceremony, education, offerings of hula and mele that bypass tourist performances. Dancers from Hula Halau and neophytes alike share the asphalt, embodying the choreography of what it means to stand with a mountain. There, over months, delegations from all over the world, but particularly from places in Oceania, present themselves in greeting and solidarity. They do not represent states, but rather families or community organizations, even as flags from all over indicate the nationalities that are represented. These are acts of resistance that reframe hospitality and the encounter according to a different ethos. They ask for permission and are granted a time and place to speak, to make manifest their intention, to stand alongside, to renew and strengthen old relationships or establish new connections. They bring gifts, an offering to the kupuna, the elders, and others who have stayed on the mountain despite threats of arrest, inclement weather, great discomfort. Part of their offering are also often stories of shared struggle as people caught in the displacements and dispossessions in the spaces of US empire in the region. The mountainside becomes a place where the intertwined histories of Asian labor and Hawaiian colonialism is put into relief. We are reminded also that there are other histories here from which we might create the possibilities for affiliations that are inhospitable to the interests of neoliberal governance or militaristic desire. These acts of reanimating practices that had been and continue to be instrumentalized to consolidate colonial modes of hospitality, to serve a different kind of hospitality, hold world-making power. Here, these acts are literally about holding ground. Aloha aina, or the love of the land. I will just keep repeating that because I think it's a beautiful kind of reminder, right? Love of the land, love of the land. A phrasing that refuses the separation or alienation of aloha from the land, and which insists on a relationality to the land that considers it as kin rather than as scenery. I go there myself with friends and colleagues, some Kanaka Maoli, others Asian or Haole settlers. As I wake and witness the ceremony, take a shift in teaching in the makeshift school that has sprung up, or in the station taking donations of clothing and blankets to keep the growing numbers of supporters warm, I see a different hospitality in practice. It is a moment that entails a painful reckoning with how Asian settlers in Hawaii and here on the continent have benefited from settler colonialism from their own participation in indigenous dispossession, especially in a time when indigenous people are working to build worlds for themselves in a region made inhospitable for them, in which Asian settlers have sometimes played a role in making less hospitable. The answer to the question of how solidarities might be built in hospitality might hinge on these very acts that have been appropriated by tourism, militarism, and imperialism to approximate consent, and on the very people who provide the most essential yet expendable labor of care upon which their structure depends. Drawing hope from these disparate, small kind acts that insist on different relations of hospitality, I center the feminized and racialized work of Native and Asian subjects as they forge intimacies of love and joy. This, I suspect, will be the archive of the project as it takes shape, an archive of templates of how we might relate to each other in sustainable and sustaining ways in our age of dwindling resources, increased migration, constant warfare, and intensified extraction. So I've looked at the lei, hula, and not just like those particular objects, but because I was in Hawaii for 17 years, those are the most familiar to me that come to mind, but they will not be, it won't be just limited to that. So, and also because I can't help myself, I'll end with the last scene of BTS over their multi-day voyage in Hawaii. Because even as they have provided the alibi of sorts for this presentation, their body of work too is a text of the unevenness, fragility, and hope in relations of hospitality. About a year or so after my sojourn to Mauna Kea, squarely in the midst of the pandemic, as I found myself watching old BTS content, I realized BTS themselves had gone to the Mauna. While they accessed it via helicopter tour and understood it primarily as a picturesque experience, that was, quote, the best part of their Hawaii tour package, unquote. An otherwise insignificant moment episodes later stuck out to me. In it, RM, the sort of leader of the group, uploads the photos he has taken of BTS's time on Mauna Kea to his family group chat. He reports his mother's observation. It's not that different from Korea. So this small moment, I want to stop here, right? This moment of recognition and similarity, right, is just kind of like stayed with me. I think it's a moment from which we might depart. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Who's the person that you mentioned about wanting to decolonize or attempt to decolonize the Q&A space?
I think it was the decolonized Smith, but I'm not.
Vernadette and I earlier were talking about ways to structure the Q&A and to kind of make an initial foray into kind of maybe decolonize what we do in these kind of traditional settings, formal academic settings, the way in which Q&As at talks like this can sometimes be and feel a little bit performative. So in the spirit of trying to shake things up a little bit, we're going to ask folks to do something a little bit different from from the normal Q&A, if that's okay with people here.
It's okay.
It's okay. It'll be good. It'll be good.
It's an invitation.
It's an invitation. What we'd like y'all to do is maybe reach out to somebody in this space right here that you have not yet had a conversation with, maybe 2 or 3 other folks, come together, peer review, right? Peer review, peer produce a question that you would like to maybe proffer up to our distinguished speaker here about any of the aspects of Vernadette's presentation today, and then hopefully we can offer it together and think through some of the kind of insights that you're bringing to this presentation as well. Maybe we could say 4 minutes for a kind of meet and greet hello. I know that because we're all human beings and we are sitting where we usually sit with the people that we do sit with, let's try to like get up and say hello to other people that might be in the same space and sharing space.
Over to somebody.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. You're the closest to me. Hearts for everyone.
I am
watching this.
Used to be a really big fan of BTS, so this was great for me. How y'all are feeling? Good, you guys can hear
The adjectives are fantasy.
That's right there too. Just FYI.
Yeah, it's like I don't want to like be like sitting here. That's not right.
Oh, I'm out.
Was like watching the day that they would have participation gifts.
There's also participation gifts.
We have participation gifts.
So if you proffer up a question, there's incredible stickers that are coming.
It's an exception, because they can grant.
Not usually.
Amber, if you can hear me, yes, I did mean for that question to go to the group.
What was the question?
On Zoom.
BTS is like bulletproof, which is really stupid. Bulletproof schoolboys, that's like a translation. There's supposed to be like more against like committees or whatever. So that's why like the volleyball player, but shallow to be long. Like, you know, it's like so they and if you look at the they very much show themselves as like, you know, militarized, like regulation. I wish I Yes. No, they are. Like they can do both. But when they first opened, their iconography was very much like bulletproof vests, you know, like long outfits against there's that militarization. It's supposed to be metaphorical.
I'm not sure about like okay, so
it is a plastic that you know, the like very hard.
I guess
Yeah, but I guess it's like if we're thinking as like a form of resistance.
Time check, let's say like maybe 1 more minute to come up with a really, really incredible question.
Like what are seen as more like what forms of like sort of
That's very good.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like that's kind of very like on the edge.
Yes.
I really.
That's something to add.
Yes, very much so.
I didn't know where you were going.
Yeah.
Then something just decided like about.
There's stuff in the chat I can't see.
And I don't know if those.
2024. Wait, is that right?
Talking as a fan. The way that BTS garnered their audience was very much like the selling of intimacy. It's like, at least most Korean K-pop idols have to go on these shows.
Sure,
Or
yeah.
like, do these games, whatever. And
See if I can, I'm gonna write them down.
And they created
I'm doing the-
their reality show, which is actually unique, like for like a South Korean idol.
All right, hi everybody. Thank you for engaging with that little exercise. Let's maybe we'll have Vernadette take a couple in turn, maybe
See?
2 questions, and then we'll see if they get addressed, and then ask for more, hopefully. Some hands.
Hands.
Hi. I was wondering about sort of like taxonomizing or disambiguating different forms of or relations to intimacy. Because I was thinking as you were talking that there's a difference, to me at least, on the one hand, something like comfort, and then on the other, something like entertainment. In that there are different emotions which those forms of activity are attempting to produce in the audience or in the guest, I suppose. And I'm wondering if that changes the relation between host and guest. As in, are, for instance, women working in massage parlors or like BTS on stage, are they existing in different relations to the idea of hospitality? Are they doing it in different ways, or is it fundamentally the same? And then I think the real question is like, does the difference in that approach, is that maybe why BTS is like capable of acting as, I don't want to be too mean, but like the long arm of Western imperialism, like, you know what I mean?
Army's gonna come after you now.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Gina, do you want to maybe proffer up your question too, and then Vernadette can choose to take them in turn?
Sure. My question is just like, I mean, assumably from how you talk about BTS, I was just wondering about your positionality pursuing this field of study or specific subject being a BTS fan, and like kind of, I guess, how, in what ways did you not have to like separate yourself, and or does being a BTS fan, do you think, inform your work in a more nuanced perspective, or I don't know, the kind of strengths and weaknesses of being part of the army, I guess, in analyzing BTS and its role.
Thank you
Do you
for
have
that
headspace
question.
for more now?
I'm writing things down, so it might be that some of the questions riff off each other, so we'll just,
Can we do one more?
one more,
Was there?
and we'll see if I can manage them.
So we were kind of just wondering about like the role of like the food industry, I guess, also in this, because we just know like food is something that kind of does also feed into kind of like narratives like exoticization and like hospitality, and so we were just kind of wondering like what your take on that was in terms of how it fits in this.
Oh, I love that, okay. Do we have anybody from online?
You want me to just ask?
Sure, I mean, let's just, I don't know that I can get to all of these, so let me
Okay, two more. We have a question from Jun Han Chen. How do you think US imperialism has hindered or boosted the development of local culture or identity in areas that are or were under occupation? A question from Jennifer Gear. Anecdotally, I've seen Americans recoil at the suggestion that they shouldn't visit a place that they want to see, i.e. Hawaii. How would you respond to this, and how does your research interact with the ideas of quote unquote responsible or ethical tourism or travel?
Can you repeat the first one?
How do you think US imperialism has hindered or boosted the development of local culture or identity in areas that are or were under occupation?
Sorry, I have to write this all down to keep it straight in my head. I don't know if this is making any sense in my head. Okay. So I'll start, I'm kind of fascinated by, I know that this whole talk was structured around BTS. So like, I'm like, oh, people want to talk about BTS. But actually the second question around attending to BTS as somebody who is also a fan, something that comes up all the time. There's a whole, believe it or not, there may now be 4, I'm not entirely sure, conferences focused on BTS, right? So in these conferences, folks talk about like what it means to be a fan and to also kind of engage with the material that BTS produces. So just to plug our project, this is them on the Mauna, by the way. Forgot to show you that. This book is coming out this August, and it is, it's got folks in it who, do sort of traditional media studies of K-pop. It's got folks who do art. It's got folks who are not necessarily BTS or K-pop scholars who are engaging with the sort of the body of text, right, and performance that BTS creates and how they engage with it in different ways. And I think that there's actually a beauty to like engaging with the material that you love. I don't think it necessarily means that a critical distance can't also be held in that same moment, right? Because it is exactly the power of love, right? Like, why do you love this object so much? And what can it teach you? What can it teach our students? And the book actually came about because so many of our students, as faculty who teach in Asian American studies, Asian studies, were engaging with the materials of K-pop. So we were like, well, what's this material? And can we think about how to take it seriously, right, in different ways? And so in that sense, it hasn't been so much an issue, but it's definitely come up in conversation around, how critical can you be given sometimes the very enthusiastic love of global fandom for BTS, like it creates a little bit of like, oh God, say anything wrong. So you want to be really careful, right? But also put them in, the context in which you are studying them. So we have essays in there from folks who are art history scholars, dance history scholars, right? All kinds of different folks who are engaging with BTS from their disciplinary backgrounds. It's a really interesting text. Food industry and hospitality. So this is actually, thank you for that question. The question of where this project is going is like completely up in the air right now. And one of the things that I'm thinking through, and in collaboration with some of my colleagues at UH Manoa, I went there in November and started just chatting with them about the project, are the kinds of like material cultures of hospitality, right, that are often produced by gendered feminized labor. So a long time ago, I'd started this project and then sort of abandoned it because I felt like as an Asian settler, Filipino ex-settler in Hawaii, it wasn't my place and I didn't have the language, I didn't have like the deep cultural knowledge of really thinking through something like the lei and the quilt. And I had actually published those pieces, but then went back to them and realized I didn't want to make this into a book because I wasn't the person to do it. On the other hand, these are texts that are also approached by and understood and interacted with by folks who are not Hawaiian. And that's exactly because they are in the sort of circuits of hospitality, right? And so the luau is one of those particular kinds of things, right? Like you were talking about food, and the way that food is this like intimate exchange, like the offering of food, the eating of food, the preparation of food is a very, it's a very like intimate act of mutuality and hospitality, right? So one of the things that is in development and which might be a direction this project ultimately takes is sort of a material cultures approach to this idea of hospitality with a focus on Hawaiian objects, right, and Hawaiian practices. So we'll return to possibly the quilt, possibly the luau, the lei, and maybe some other, to make like a nice packaged monograph. But in some other kind of, in the other Vernadette brain that this project is developing, I think about things like food and like now Biden wants to do food drops in Palestine, right? And like different aspects of like the quilt or the blanket as like this intimate wrapping, right, that touches your body. And like I think about those Mylar blankets that are offered to the children at the border, right? And so I think about like these sort of moments of misinterpretation of these kinds of objects as possibilities that maybe a more theoretical direction might go, but I'm not really sure how this project is gonna take shape yet. I'm still trying to grapple with that. I feel like it's like 4 different books that I'm trying to do. And the BTS thing is honestly just like a fun thing. And it is already a book, so, but it, so in that sense, it's kind of related to this question, right? The taxonomizing the different kinds of forms of intimacy that are produced, right? So if we're looking at those types of objects, these are like much more legitimate kinds of circulating objects, right? That are about comfort, that are about welcome versus more sexualized kinds of interactions, right? That are built more around entertainment. So that's something I'm also grappling with, like one of the other sort of offshoots that this project might become down the line is a more specific focus on sort of the labor in camp towns and in places like camp towns, right? As this sort of entertainment, the idea of entertainment brought to its like most extreme manifestation, right, of sexualized labor, sexualized gendered work. I'm currently grappling with this particular moment in the archives in Hawaii when I went back in November. And again, so many things that I'm playing with right now in terms of the material. There is a riot in 1916 in Hawaii, in the sex district in Iwilei in Honolulu, by white, which is like mostly Japanese sex workers. And it's a riot by Black soldiers who are sort of transiting through. And I'm like just really interested in those moments where, like you said, the racial gender taxonomies of who's doing this kind of work to prop up empire in the region sort of collide, right? So, I don't know if I want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, honestly. It's a really interesting moment, but so that particular direction of the project might go and focus more on like things like the moments of violence where hospitality really breaks down, right? The Jennifer Laude case, the rape case in Okinawa, right? Or rape cases in Okinawa. These are usually multiple cases, but like we see them in the more spectacularized kind of moments. Atlanta killings, right? And so tracking those as like the possible archive of thinking through this particular, the specificity of that particular kind of aspect of hospitality versus something like the material cultures of aloha, right? That are very much different, although they're part of the same kind of general language of hospitality. Let's see. Responsible tourism. So like that's what Detours is trying to kind of create, right? It's not like hey, here's a guide, go be a responsible tourist, but it's really about getting folks to think about place and responsibilities to place, even in your home place, right? So the idea around detours is that the kinds of ethical relations and questions that it hopes to provoke are not necessarily just things that people think about when they're coming to Hawaii, right? But things that you might actually think about in your relation to the place that you're in, because many of us are not native to the places that we live in, right? So how do we bring the kinds of thinking around reciprocity and obligation and thinking through relations to place and stewardship of place to the places that we do live, right? And how can that be a mode of radical hospitality that might lay the foundations for something different, like a different relation to place, you know? And something I've been thinking about, because I just left Hawaii this past year, and I'm building a new relationship to Berkeley, where I did get my PhD, but I feel very unsettled in the newness of that relationship and trying to think through what my relationships to this place might be in this moment. So. Any other questions? Oh, I do have stickers.
Maybe Brenda, one last question.
One last
I don't
question.
need to go either.
You can have a sticker.
Since you used the term militarized sex work, militarized intimacies, I was wondering what you think about BTS's kind of militarized iconography that they use, the ways that they portray themselves as like defenders against like conformism, like against like non-original music.
Yeah. Well, I think about it as like people are complex, right? And the way that K-pop works is like it takes up particular kinds of themes and concepts. So part of BTS's early body of work very much played on sort of very militarized marches, and this is part of one of my colleagues who's a dance history scholar would talk about like how this is part like the very synchronized almost step style choreography, right, is reminiscent of military marches and maneuvers, right? And then the uniforms, and then the light stick is called an army bomb, and the fandom is called army. So there's a lot of some really interesting overlaps with that. At the same time, some of their early songs are actually kind of like, wait, is this like a critique of militarism, right? So if you look at some of Augustine's early songs in particular, there's some really interesting rap lyrics that are quite, if not explicitly, definitely sort of beside explicit about militarism and authoritarianism. On the other hand, as K-pop figures, and especially because they're so famous, I think that their reach is large, but they're really constrained by that cage of fame and like the way that they have been slotted into that sort of that role as the ambassadors of Korea, right? They can say only so much. So I don't know if I answered your question though. Yeah. My dream as a fan is that they come out of the military, once they leave the military, because I think part of why my thinking is like you have to be careful going in because, it's a pretty right-wing government right now, et cetera. Like the military is a conservative institution to begin with. Is that they'll leave and then they'll have a demilitarized album.
On that note, on the promise of a demilitarized BTS album, do me a favor, please join me in giving Vernadette a round of applause.
Thanks so much.
Please do come up and talk to Vernadette, get some stickers, get some flyers. Also really quick, our next, I think it's actually the next, but also the last Transnational Asia Speaker Series lecture is going to be happening on March 28th at 4:30 in Herring Hall. It's going to be Christopher Fan from UC Irvine, Northeast Asian American Literature in the Era of Deindustrialization. So please, if you're around, do come to that as well. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for coming.
Come talk to Vernadette and take care.
We have Apps for Abolition stickers.